The previous lecture explored the idea that giving up free will would have terrible consequences. It was the lecture that has a pessimistic view about giving up free will. Smolansky argued that if people find out that they don't have free will, this could lead to all kinds of bad consequences. In addition to the sorts of considerations that we've already seen about Smolansky raising problems about more sort of moral views, ideas about whether people will take responsibility for their actions, ideas about whether we'll feel like our achievements count as our own. Other philosophers have worried that if you come to think that you don't have free will, that might uproot ideas about love and gratitude and forgiveness and resentment. So all of these things seem to be under threat if we give up the idea of free will. And that presents a really pessimistic view, obviously. So this idea is that if free will doesn't exist, then we end up with a really despairing picture of what the world will be like. Today's lecture will consider a more optimistic perspective concerning what will happen if people give up the idea of free will. Cornell philosopher Dirk Perboom sort of has the happy face version of free will skepticism. So he, like a number of other philosophers we've seen, thinks that there's no such thing as free will. So like Galen Strawson, for instance, Perboom's arguments against free will don't depend on determinism at all. He doesn't think that we don't have free will because determinism is true. He thinks it doesn't matter at all whether determinism is true, that free will is just not in the cards for us. So Perboom has a number of sophisticated arguments that I won't go through here, but the core idea is pretty familiar. It's that the kind of free will that we think we have is agent causation. That is, we think that the way we make choices is that the agent gets to make a choice without being determined or random. But Perboom thinks, as many other philosophers do, that there's good reason to doubt that this is even something that's remotely plausible, that the agent somehow causes an action without being determined or random. So he gives up the idea of free will altogether. But in his book called Living Without Free Will, he argues that recognizing that there's no such thing as free will won't have bad effects at all. In fact, in some ways, he thinks it will have positively good effects. Before we get to Perboom's optimism, though, it's important to broach another issue that's been lurking in the background for the last two lectures. In Lecture 18, we considered whether, if we came to believe in determinism, we should try to subdue our feelings of resentment and stop blaming others for their actions. We also saw that Peter Strawson suggested that the only way to make such a decision, that is, the only way to make a decision about whether or not to subdue our resentment, is by considering what he called the gains and losses to human life. But at that point, you might be saying, hold on, if we're going to decide whether or not to blame and punish people, shouldn't we also consider right and wrong? Maybe we'd feel better if we kept our emotional reactions. Maybe we'd feel better if we sustained our resentment towards people who do bad things. But that doesn't mean that we should do it, because when we ask what we should do, we're asking a moral question. And speaking in terms of gains and losses seems to bypass those considerations. It seems to ignore the moral considerations. So you might worry that if somebody says, oh, if we're trying to decide whether to continue to resent people, all we should look at is gains and losses, that a person who says that seems to leave out the possibility that maybe it's immoral to resent and blame people who are innocent. So a number of philosophers maintain that in addition to questions about what would help human society, what the gains and losses would be, we need to ask questions about morality when we're trying to decide whether to change the way we treat each other. If we deny the existence of free will, so if we deny the existence of free will, then morality should play a role in figuring out how we should modify our behavior. In particular, philosophers worry about the role of fairness, that we need to take into consideration, into consideration issues about whether it's fair to treat people a certain way. So if we lack libertarian free will, then we might conclude that it's unfair to continue treating people as if they were morally responsible. And this generates what we can call the fairness argument. And I'll just give a sort of rough version of this argument. We can put the first premise as follows. Roughly, if all decisions are entirely a product of determinism or chance, then it's unfair to hold people responsible. And then the second premise would be something like, all decisions are entirely a product of determinism or chance. That's basically the free will skeptic premise. It says there's no free will. Therefore, the conclusion follows, it's unfair to hold people responsible. The first premise here that says it's unfair to hold people responsible if their decisions come from determinism or chance, that's just supposed to be something that's compellingly intuitive, something that we can all appreciate as a moral truth. The second premise, that all decisions are a product of determinism or chance, that depends on the kinds of arguments for free will skepticism that we've already seen in previous lectures. So, more simply, we might cast the first premise as saying that if people don't have libertarian free will, then it's unfair to hold them responsible. And the second premise could say that people don't have libertarian free will. If you accept that, then you seem to be forced to the conclusion that it's unfair to hold people responsible. One way to see the force of this argument is to consider two individuals equally a product of determinism. Let's just assume determinism is true for these purposes. If one of them is determined to do bad things, and the other is determined not to do bad things, then how can it be fair to punish one and reward the other? We can trace through their entire history and explain at each juncture how each of their actions and each of their situations was inevitable. So the fact that one of them ended up being, say, a thief and the other ended up being a banker, that was just inevitable. So how can it be fair to blame and punish the thief and reward the banker? So the one who did the bad things, the one who became a thief, was just dealt a bad hand, and the one who became a banker was just dealt a good hand. So far in these lectures, I've largely ignored this kind of question about fairness. Pereboom, on the other hand, is deeply moved by it. He thinks that the fact that it is unfair to hold people responsible is a key reason that we have to change our practices. That is, we morally are obliged to change our practices. The philosopher we considered in the last lecture, Smolansky, is also moved by the fairness argument. He doesn't dismiss it. He thinks it's a very serious concern. But he's also really concerned about the possibility that there will be disastrous consequences if we expose the illusion of free will to the public at large. So even though Smolansky is very sensitive to the issue of fairness, he attends to it, he's worried about it, he's more cautious about recommending changing the way things are because he's worried about what kind of bad things might happen if we did it. Pereboom thinks we really need to face up to the fact that it's not fair to hold people responsible, and we need to fully acknowledge our lack of free will. Since we don't have free will, he says, that means we're not morally responsible for our actions, and that means we need to take very seriously the fact that it's unfair to treat people as if they were. So we don't deserve praise or blame for our actions. Since we don't have free will, we don't deserve anything, Pereboom says. Still, he says, this can all be granted without giving up too much. Indeed, he maintains that recognizing that we don't have free will really could lead to improvements in our lives. So his view marries a skepticism about free will with an optimism about a future in which we develop and embrace the fact that we don't have free will. So, according to Pereboom, many of the attitudes that we have will and should remain unaffected or relatively unaffected by the rejection of free will. So, as we saw in the last lecture, Smolansky thought that our sense of achievement would be sacrificed if we come to think we don't have free will. But Pereboom rejects this kind of despondency. Says, suppose you have the goal to save starving children. That's what you most want to do. And you engage in a course of action that's directed at saving starving children. That is, your actions actually do help to save starving children. In that case, Pereboom says, you can be pleased about your achievement, even if you realize that you don't deserve praise for it. What you really wanted to come out of your action did come to pass, and you might be very pleased with that. So you wanted to save starving children, your action did end up having starving children be saved. You can be really happy about that. It's funny because Smolansky actually tackles exactly the same phenomenon from the pessimistic vantage. He focuses on the fact that if you don't have free will, you don't deserve praise. When we focus on that, it does seem kind of icky and dispiriting. For Pereboom, though, the glass is really half full. You can still be very pleased at what your actions achieved, even though your actions weren't free and you don't deserve praise. Indeed, you can see how Peerboom would think that maybe it's a bit self-indulgent to get so obsessed over whether I really deserve praise for saving starving children. You might say, look, starving children got saved. That's what's important, not whether or not I deserve praise for it. So I can still feel like, yes, it's an achievement. This great thing flowed from my action, and I can be I can have a sense of satisfaction about that without thinking that I deserve to be praised for it. Now, as mentioned above, Peerboom thinks that if we lack free will, then we don't deserve praise for our moral character or our actions. And here again, he would agree with Smolansky. Although we do lose this sense of self-praise, Peerboom says that much of our sense of self-worth can be sustained. So we value natural intelligence and athletic ability, even when we don't think those traits were freely chosen. So even when we think that those abilities were a product of genetic good luck, we admire Einstein's genius, even though at least much of that was simply luck. We admire Wilt Chamberlain's basketball prowess, even though he didn't get to be so tall by free choice. So Peerboom thinks that this applies as well to our sense of moral good character. People often think that their character, their moral character, has a lot to do with how they were raised. So I regard myself as a moral person, and I think my parents had a lot to do with that. But Peerboom says that doesn't need to threaten moral self-worth. Rather, what often happens is when you think, well, the reason I'm a good person is because my parents had something to do with it, it makes you feel fortunate, that I feel fortunate for having the parents and upbringing that I did. So when we reflect on the positive influences that our parents have had on our moral character, it's not like we kick the dirt and curse ourselves for not building up our moral character from scratch. We don't sulk and say, well, I didn't get the moral character myself. My parents instilled it in me. More typically, we just feel thankful that we ended up with the good moral character that we did for having good parents who led us to have the good moral character. Now, some maintain that on the issue of gratefulness, it won't make sense to feel grateful at all if we lack free will, because we could only be grateful to someone when they deserve praise. Peerboom says that this might be part of the story about gratitude. Part of what is involved in being grateful to someone is often that we think the person freely chose to do us a kindness. But this isn't the whole story. If we give up the idea that people deserve our gratitude, we still get to retain part of our reaction of gratitude, because when we feel grateful, much of what matters is being thankful for some helpful thing that a person has done. And that's something like gratitude anyway. And you get this, for instance, when small children engage in helpful actions, even when nobody thinks that they yet have any kind of serious free will. Very young children, for instance, certainly before the second birthday at about 18 months, they engage in comforting behaviors towards family members. So one thing they do when they see another person in distress is they'll give that person their own comfort object. So if they see their mom crying, they'll offer her their doll. And this is obviously a really touching thing when a child shows this kind of empathy. And it generates a feeling like gratitude toward the child, even though we might not think that at 18 months the child has free will. More generally, though, we can certainly be made happy when others are generous to us, even if we think that their actions aren't free. And we can have a positive disposition towards them, even if we think that those actions weren't free. Well, what about the idea of forgiveness, though? That seems to depend on a belief in free will. But Peerboom says, no, much of what's really important about forgiveness is independent of the belief in free will. So, suppose you have a friend who repeatedly mistreats you, and as a result, you break off the friendship. But then the friend expresses genuine regret and vows not to mistreat you again. In that case, Peerboom says it might be appropriate to forgive the person and resume the friendship. The one element of forgiveness that doesn't get preserved is the idea that the friend deserved to be blamed for his actions. But the idea that you can put his actions behind you and move on, that part of forgiveness can certainly still be retained. Peerboom also thinks that we need to address this issue about love. Some people have said, well, maybe loving another person depends on thinking that the other person freely chose to love you. But there are lots of different kinds of love, and that's surely not what happens in parent-child love. Parents love their children for reasons that go beyond and run deeper than any issues about free will. We don't love our babies because we think they have free will, nor do we love them because we think we have free will. Coming to give up on the idea of free will wouldn't disrupt the deep biological current that leads us to love our children. Love among adults is no doubt a different phenomenon, but many factors contribute to it, and it's unlikely to be so fragile as to collapse if we deny free will. So consider first romantic love. I think it's independently plausible that romantic love is caused by processes well outside of anything free. So even if you believe in free will, you might think romantic love doesn't have a lot to do with it, that we often fall in love for reasons that we can't even fathom. It doesn't feel like a free choice. People often feel like they fall in love despite themselves, that I didn't want to fall in love with her. I was just overcome. I couldn't help it. So let's turn to a third kind of love, the kind of love found in relationships that have persisted for years. Perhaps we do think that our marital partners, say, freely chose us. But would we suddenly find our marriage loveless if we came to think that we didn't have free will? That is, if we came to think that neither of us freely chose the other, would that throw us into doubt over whether we really love each other? I suspect that in most marriages that have persisted for years, even if you come to think you don't have free will, the worry about whether you and your partner freely chose each other is probably not the biggest issue in your marriage. So far, Perboom has said that many of the positive attitudes we have about ourselves, our sense of self-worth, our sense of achievement, can be largely retained even after we give up free will. Similarly, many of the positive emotions we feel towards each other, like love and gratitude, can still be largely retained after rejecting free will. So far, you might think Perboom is sounding a bit like a compatibilist. He admits that we need to rethink our reactions somewhat in light of the fact that we don't have free will, but in each case, we basically get to keep a critical part of the reaction, whether it be self-worth, achievement, gratitude, or love. Now, however, he thinks we need to turn to attitudes that won't survive the rejection of free will: anger and guilt. He thinks that if we don't have free will, it's not appropriate for us to feel guilty about our actions, and it's not appropriate for us to feel angry or resentful at another person's actions, because none of the actions is freely produced. So Perboom says, he says all of this follows from the fact that we don't have free will. If we don't have free will, we shouldn't feel guilty and we shouldn't get angry. But he hastens to add in optimistic fashion that this isn't much of a problem really, and it may even be a good thing. So anger or resentment often depends on thinking that another person is to blame for an action. So when I get angry at the motorist who wildly cuts across traffic, it's because I think the guy freely made this reckless decision. Or when I hear about a murderer who, say, kills a stranger to take his money, I get angry. And that reaction depends on my assumption that he freely made this immoral decision. If we don't have free will, then that kind of anger is unjustified, Perboom says, because it depends on an incorrect assumption. I thought the driver had free will, and I presumed the murderer had free will, but they don't, neither does anybody else. So whenever anger arises, I should try to squelch it because it's just not appropriate. That's what Perboom thinks. So when it comes to the emotions of resentment and moral anger, it's just not sustainable to keep those emotions if you don't believe in free will. It's irrational to feel those emotions once you recognize that there's no such thing as free will. Perboom claims that altering our behavior to eliminate resentment and anger would be largely a good thing because anger often leads to terrible outcomes like ethnic conflicts and feuds between groups as well as domestic abuse. Anger is at the heart of many of these social ills, and so he thinks it would be a good thing to get rid of it. Although Perboom thinks that we should get rid of anger, he also acknowledges that anger might have some beneficial effects. So one thing is, and this will come up again in a later lecture, that anger signals intolerance for mistreatment. It might be that many social movements were successful because the participants felt a sense of moral outrage at their mistreatment. As one author put it, it's not clear that the women's rights movement would have been so effective if the women had just said something like, do you think we could get some more rights over here? I mean, part of what made the movement effective was the fact that it was fueled by a passionate outrage at perceived injustices. On a more individual level, the anticipation of another's anger can provide an important source of motivation to behave. So if I think that another person will be angered by my mistreatment, that might deter me from mistreating him. In that way, anger motivates a would-be wrongdoer to behave. But Peerboom maintains that the good effects of anger can largely be achieved with other emotions, like sadness. For instance, seeing the suffering of the victim might trigger sadness in the wrongdoer, and anticipating such sadness might motivate a wrongdoer not to mistreat another person. It remains to be shown that this will really be as effective as anger. But in any case, Peerboom might say, the anger is just out of place morally. Again, it's unfair to feel angry at these people because everything they do is determined. Guilt also, he thinks, depends on thinking that we're morally responsible and deserve blame for our bad actions. So if we aren't morally responsible, it seems like guilt is another misplaced emotion. Now, much guilt might be bad, might be harmful obsessing over things that couldn't be helped. A standard story from Freudian psychology is that guilt is a really bad, destructive emotion. Interestingly, the same sentiment is echoed by serial killer Ted Bundy. In an interview from Death Row, he said, this is a direct quote, "Guilt, it's this mechanism that we use to control people. It's an illusion. It's a kind of social control mechanism, and it's very unhealthy. It does terrible things to our bodies, and there are much better ways to control our behavior than that rather extraordinary use of guilt. I guess I am in the enviable position of not having to deal with guilt. There's just no reason for it." So says Ted Bundy. However, some guilt actually does seem to have good consequences, and the fact that Ted Bundy disparages guilt might be a good indicator that guilt is important for normal functioning. Presumably, Bundy wouldn't have killed all those women if he did have to deal with guilt. In the normal population, it's likely that the anticipation of guilt serves as an important motivational factor in not behaving immorally. When John thinks about cheating on his wife, his anticipation of the subsequent guilt might lead him to stay true. Much research now indicates that guilt motivates an individual to repair damaged relationships, for example, by motivating the person to make amends in various ways. So suffice it to say that if you're looking for a long-term relationship, you might want to avoid people who have no sense of guilt. Peerboom suggests that, well, instead of blaming ourselves and feeling guilt, we would be justified in feeling regret, which would still motivate us to repair damaged relationships. The idea is that I wouldn't say to myself, I'm blameworthy for that mean thing I did to you and I feel guilty about it. Instead, I say to myself, I'm not blameworthy for that mean thing because it was all determined, but I deeply regret that I did it. That feeling of regret would still motivate me, Peerboom says, to apologize and make amends. I do wonder, though, if regret would be an adequate substitute for guilt. If I can always tell myself that I don't deserve blame, it seems that that might at least somewhat detract from my moral motivation. At a minimum, you'd likely get in trouble with your partner if you said, I deeply regret cheating on you and I will definitely buy you some flowers, but of course, I can't really be blamed for my infidelity. Peerboom's view is that it would be to the good to subdue our anger and resentment. And that idea resonates with a central strand in a very different tradition, Buddhism. It's regarded as intrinsically good in Buddhism to calm our anger to achieve a kind of broad-based compassion for everyone. This is a familiar and pervasive theme in Buddhism. As we saw in Lecture 10, one line of Buddhist thought leads to the view that there's no free will. And their rejection of anger fits well with the framework of skepticism about free will. In place of anger, Buddhism prescribes meditative exercises to achieve compassion, and this compassion should be directed towards everyone, including those who would anger us. One exercise for squelching one's anger is to focus on determinism, to remind oneself that the person's action was the result of past causes. One Buddhist philosopher says, I'm updating somewhat here, I feel no anger towards germs, but they cause great suffering. So why should I feel anger towards people? Whatever they do, whatever people do, is just a function of the conditioning factors that led to their actions. So when a friend or an enemy behaves badly, you just remind yourself that their action is determined by their conditions. In this way, it's suggested you can repel the anger and remain happy. You just remind yourself that the person is no more responsible than the germ. This kind of advice could equally well be given by Peerboom. If we step back and remember that the wrongdoer is determined, then he thinks our anger should abate. We should get less anger towards them. Another kind of exercise that's recommended in the Buddhist path here is to encourage us to remember that there's no self that performed the action that would provoke anger in the first place. So the anger doesn't really make any sense. Again, this appeals to the Buddhist idea that the idea of self is an illusion. So one of the Buddhist philosophers from the 5th century named Buddhaghosa says that if some act occurs that angers you, you should just remind yourself that what we think of as the self doesn't exist as something that continues through time. It's just a momentary collection of states. So let's say that you're angry because of some odious act that occurred 5 minutes ago. That bad action was caused by a collection of momentary states. And all of those states are now gone, since they're all just fleeting. So now, Buddhaghosa wrote, what is it that you're angry with? And his suggestion seems to be, just remind yourself that the other self doesn't even exist. And once you do that, you'll see that the anger doesn't make any sense at all, for there's not even a proper target for the anger. It was caused by some states that were fleeting and now are gone altogether. Furthermore, Buddhists would maintain that even while the states existed, it was just a hodgepodge in any case. There wasn't any kernel of self when the act was created. So when you see through the illusion of the self and recognize that it's just a big collection of these fleeting states, then if you get angry, you should ask yourself, well, which bit of the collection you're angry at? And once you start doing that, once you start focusing on that level, which they think is the level of reality, then it becomes apparent how absurd it is. So let me give an example to illustrate the basic idea, although the details here differ from how the Buddhists would put it. So suppose someone insults me by saying that my bike helmet looks stupid, and this makes me feel angry at him. But then I remember that he is just a collection of traits. There's no core self there. So then I have to get more specific. I say, well, which bit of the collection should I get mad at? The perception of my helmet? The intention to say, nice helmet, dude? The goal to insult me? At least the last one of these, the goal to insult me. That seems like the best candidate so far for something that would be an appropriate target of anger. But then I have to think, but that's just one single little mental state, one goal. It's just one fleeting thing. How can I be mad at a goal? At that point, the Buddhist can say, I should see that the anger makes no sense whatsoever. Now, once again here, the upshot is that since we don't have free will, we should give up our anger. It should lead us to sort of modify our anger and suppress it. And this, the Buddhists thought, could only help our own state of mind. Like Parabum, they think that giving up anger would be entirely beneficial. And one way to give up our anger, to get rid of our anger, is by reflecting on the fact that there's no such thing as free will, or that there's no such thing as a self that could be held responsible for making free choices. These last 3 lectures have focused on how we should change our interactions with each other in light of the free will problem. One response in Lecture 18 was that the free will problem is just remote from our everyday emotions, and as a result, the problem neither will nor should affect our everyday interactions with each other. So we shouldn't try to alter the way we treat our friends or colleagues or family members, or ourselves for that matter. We should leave everything as it is, because the issues about determinism are just way too abstract and removed to have direct implications for our everyday lives. Lecture 19 focused on the worry that if people came to think that they didn't have free will, then this would have significant effects on how we interact with each other. So unlike the Strawson view we found in Lecture 18, he thinks that, oh yeah, it would make a big difference if people came to think that they were determined. Moreover, Smolansky in that lecture maintains that those changes on balance would be for the worse, maybe even leading to a moral meltdown. And the prescription in that case was just to let people persist in their illusion of free will, so to let it ride, not to say anything. Today's lecture offers a third perspective. First, if we don't have free will, then we ought morally to recognize this and alter our lives accordingly. We shouldn't keep the truth hidden. Part of the reason we shouldn't keep the truth hidden is because it's unfair to treat people as if they were responsible if they really aren't. Second, though, Peerboom maintains that our lives really won't be diminished and may even be enhanced when we alter our lives in light of the fact that we don't have free will. So all of these discussions over the last 3 lectures have been focused on questions about how to conduct our everyday lives, how we should conduct our interactions with each other. They've all been based on private lives, in effect. The next lectures will focus on questions that rise at the level of public policy, about how questions of free will should affect issues about punishment and other questions that are more global. And so we'll turn to those kinds of broad concerns in the next lecture.